The late afternoon
What
sun
happened
filtered
to
through
your
the thin white
arm?
blinds of Mr. Sterling's kitchen,
I
cutting
fell.
sharp lines across the marble floor.
You can tell me
The
the
apartment was
truth.
always quiet at this time of day. It was the kind of expensive, heavy silence that you only find in places where everything is polished and nothing is out of place. Mr. Sterling liked it that way. He sat at the large island in the center of the room, his reading glasses sliding down his nose slightly as he looked over the blueprints spread out in front of him. He was an architect, a man who spent his life designing structures that were supposed to stand strong against anything. But today, he couldn't focus. The lines on the paper were blurring together, and the silence of the apartment felt less like peace and more like it was waiting for something to break. In the background, there was the soft, rhythmic sound of a sponge wiping against a counter. It was Mrs. Gable. She had been coming to clean Mr. Sterling's apartment for 5 years, every Tuesday and Thursday, like clockwork. She was a small woman with quick hands and a habit of disappearing into her work. She never complained, never asked for a raise, and never talked about her life outside these walls. She was just there, keeping his world in order. Mr. Sterling appreciated that. He liked people who didn't make waves. But today, the routine was different. About an hour ago, the security buzzer had rung. It wasn't the delivery man with groceries, and it wasn't the neighbor asking for a package. It was a young girl. Mr. Sterling had watched the black and white monitor on the wall, seeing the girl standing in the hallway, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She looked young, maybe 14 or 15, wearing a faded hoodie that was 2 sizes too big for her. When Mrs. Gable had let her in, the air in the apartment seemed to change. The girl, whose name was Sophie, didn't say much. She just walked in with a backpack slung over one shoulder, keeping her head down. Mrs. Gable had whispered a quick, nervous apology to Mr. Sterling, explaining that there was a small issue with the plumbing in their apartment building and they had turned the water off for the day. She couldn't leave Sophie alone in the house with no water, so she asked if the girl could just sit quietly and do homework while she finished cleaning. Mr. Sterling, feeling generous and not wanting to disrupt his own schedule, had simply nodded and gone back to his papers. He didn't think much of it at first. He assumed the girl would sit at the small table near the window, bury her nose in a book, and wait. However, as the afternoon wore on, Mr. Sterling found it harder to ignore the presence of another person. He wasn't used to the sound of another person breathing in the same room as him. He found himself listening to the soft rustle of fabric as Sophie moved. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't sit down. Instead, she seemed restless, pacing slowly around the living area, looking at the expensive furniture and the abstract paintings on the walls as if they were alien artifacts. She looked out of place, fragile, like a small bird that had flown into a glass building by mistake. Mrs. Gable was working faster than usual. She was scrubbing the kitchen counters with a frantic energy, her back turned to her daughter. She seemed to be trying to make as much noise as possible, the scrubbing sound loud and harsh, as if she was trying to drown out her own thoughts or prevent any conversation from starting. "Can I help?" Mr. Sterling heard Sophie ask. Her voice was quiet, raspy, like she hadn't used it in a while. "No," Mrs. Gable said immediately, her voice sharp and high. "Just sit, Sophie. Please, just sit, and be still." Sophie let out a small sigh and walked toward the sink. "I'm just thirsty. I'm going to get a glass of water." "Don't touch the crystal," Mrs. Gable snapped, turning around for a split second before going back to the counter. "Use the plastic one in the cabinet." Mr. Sterling watched this interaction with a growing sense of unease. The tension between the mother and daughter was thick, palpable. It wasn't the normal annoyance of a teenager with a parent. It felt heavier than that, loaded with something dark. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to shake the feeling that he was intruding on something private, even though it was happening in his own home. Sophie reached up to the high cabinet to get the plastic cup. As she stretched, her sleeve pulled back. Mr. Sterling froze. The blueprints under his elbows were completely forgotten. The light from the window hit Sophie's arm, illuminating the skin in a way that left no room for imagination. There, wrapped around her forearm like a dark, sickening bracelet, was a collection of bruises. They weren't fresh, they were in various stages of healing, some a deep purple, others fading to a sickly yellow and green. They were shaped like fingerprints. Someone had grabbed her arm hard, someone with a strong grip, and squeezed until the blood vessels under the skin burst. Mr. Sterling felt a cold chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked up from the arm to Sophie's face. She had the cup now, but she wasn't drinking. She was staring at her own arm, quickly pulling her sleeve down to cover the marks. She turned her head slightly, and her eyes met Mr. Sterling's. They were wide, filled with a sudden, terrified panic. It was the look of an animal caught in a trap. For a split second, nobody moved. The scrubbing sound from Mrs. Gable stopped instantly. She must have sensed the change in the room, or perhaps she had seen Mr. Sterling's gaze fixed on her daughter's arm. She turned around slowly, her face pale, her hands dripping soapy water onto the pristine floor. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling so badly she almost choked on the words. I am almost finished. I will get the floor." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the tiles, scrubbing at a non-existent spot. She knew he had seen. The realization hit Mr. Sterling with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Mrs. Gable, a woman he considered gentle, kind, and harmless. He looked at Sophie, a quiet girl who flinched at her own mother's voice. The bruises were undeniable. They were violent. They were cruel. The silence that returned to the room was no longer peaceful or expansive. It was suffocating. Mr. Sterling sat there, his hands gripping the edge of the marble counter until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to say something. He wanted to demand an explanation. He wanted to shout. But the words stuck in his throat. He saw the way Sophie was trembling, the way she was trying to make herself invisible against the pantry door. He saw the way Mrs. Gable was refusing to look up, her shoulders shaking slightly. It was a secret that had just walked into his kitchen, and now that he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. The bruises painted a picture of a reality that existed just outside his ordered, perfect life, a reality of pain and fear. Mr. Sterling realized that his Tuesday routine was over. Nothing in this apartment would ever feel the same again. The safe, quiet world he lived in had just been shattered, not by a loud noise or a broken window, but by the sight of a young girl's arm and the dark marks that told a story he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. The tension in the room was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out, leaving behind a thick, suffocating vacuum. Nobody moved for what felt like a long time. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the background, a noise that usually went unnoticed but now seemed irritatingly loud. Mr. Sterling sat frozen at the island, his hands still gripping the edge of the cold marble. He felt a strange mix of anger and confusion churning in his stomach, making him feel slightly nauseous. He looked at Mrs. Gable, expecting her to scream, to cry, or to yell at him to mind his own business. But she did none of those things. She just stood there, shoulders slumped, looking defeated. She grabbed a rough towel from the counter and dried her hands, slowly and methodically, as if performing the task was the only thing keeping her together. Then, she finally lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed and tired, filled with a look of such deep shame that Mr. Sterling had to look away. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't try to lie and say Sophie fell down the stairs. She just whispered that dinner was ready. It was absurd. Mrs. Gable had somehow managed to put a meal on the table in the midst of all that silence. It was just simple pasta, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce now filling the kitchen, clashing horribly with the dark mood of the room. "Eat, Mrs. Gable said softly, nudging Sophie toward the small round table near the window. Sophie didn't argue. She moved like a ghost, floating toward the chair and sinking into it. She kept her head down, her long hair falling like a curtain to cover her face. Mrs. Gable brought over 3 plates. She set one in front of Mr. Sterling, even though he hadn't asked for food. He realized then that she was trying to normalize things. She was trying to act as if this was just a normal Tuesday evening, as if he hadn't just seen the ugly truth stamped on her daughter's skin. Mr. Sterling stood up slowly, his legs feeling stiff. He walked over to the table and sat down opposite Sophie. He looked at the food. It looked good, but he had completely lost his appetite. He looked at Mrs. Gable, who sat at the third seat, her posture stiff. She picked up her fork, her hand shaking just enough for the silverware to click against the plate. "I apologize for the state of things, sir," Mrs. Gable mumbled, staring intently at her pasta. "I know this is unprofessional. I will finish up and we will go." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. The sound was harsh and scratched the silence. "You don't have to leave yet," he said, surprising himself. "Please. Eat." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was because he didn't want to be alone with his thoughts, or maybe he just didn't want them to go back to whatever nightmare they were living in. He picked up his own fork and twirled some noodles, but he didn't bring them to his mouth. He watched Sophie. She was using her left hand to eat, keeping her right arm, the bruised one, tucked close to her side. Every time she shifted in her chair, she winced, a small, almost imperceptible flinch that anyone else would miss. But Mr. Sterling was watching for it now. The scene felt wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Here they were, sitting in a luxurious apartment with expensive furniture and art on the walls, eating a decent meal, while the girl at the table looked like a prisoner of war. The contrast made Mr. Sterling's head hurt. He spent his life designing buildings where people were safe, where the walls were thick and the locks were sturdy. But he couldn't design a life that was safe from what was happening to this girl. He tried to force himself to act normal. He tried to be the employer, the man who paid the bills. "How is school, Sophie?" he asked. His voice sounded too loud, too cheerful, like a bad actor in a play. Sophie froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. She didn't look up. "It's fine," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet he barely heard her. "What are you studying?" Mr. Sterling pressed, desperate to fill the silence with something other than the sound of chewing. "History, math." "I like art," Sophie said, so softly it was almost a breath. Then, as if realizing she had said too much, she clamped her mouth shut and went back to pushing her food around the plate. Mrs. Gable let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh that sounded more like a sob. She quickly covered her mouth with her napkin. "She has a good imagination," Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight. "Too much imagination." Mr. Sterling looked at Mrs. Gable. He saw the way her jaw was clenched, the way the muscles in her neck were pulled tight. She wasn't looking at her daughter with love or warmth, she was looking at her with fear. It was a terrifying realization. Mrs. Sterling was afraid of Sophie. Or maybe, she was afraid for Sophie. Mr. Sterling couldn't tell which one it was, and that uncertainty was eating him alive. He looked back at the bruises, which were just peeking out from under Sophie's sleeve again as she reached for her water glass. The purple fingerprints seemed to glow in the soft light of the kitchen. They were violent. They were hateful. In his mind, Mr. Sterling tried to picture Mrs. Gable hitting her daughter. He tried to picture the woman who gently polished his silverware grabbing a child and squeezing her arm until it turned black and blue. He couldn't make the image fit. It was like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. Maybe it wasn't Mrs. Gable. The thought crept into his mind, uninvited. Maybe it was someone else. A father, a boyfriend, but Mrs. Gable never mentioned anyone else. It was always just her and Sophie, two against the world. And if it was someone else hurting the girl, why did Mrs. Gable look so guilty? Why did she act like she was the one who had done something wrong? Is everything okay at home? Mr. Sterling asked. The question was blunt, rude even. He knew he was crossing a line. He knew he was breaking the unspoken contract between employer and employee. Mrs. Gable dropped her fork. It clattered loudly onto the ceramic plate, making Sophie jump in her seat. The older woman's face drained of all color, leaving it a sickly gray. She stared at Mr. Sterling, her eyes wide and terrified. "Everything is fine, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low and hard, like a warning. "Please. Just eat your dinner." She reached out and grabbed a breadstick, snapping it in half with unnecessary force. The message was clear: stop asking. You don't want to know. But he did want to know. The sight of those bruises was burned into his retinas. He felt a strange responsibility, heavy and pressing, right in the center of his chest. He had seen it. He couldn't just wipe the plate clean and forget about it. They finished the meal in agonizing silence. The only sounds were the scraping of silverware and the occasional gulp of water. It was the most uncomfortable dinner Mr. Sterling had ever sat through. When they were done, Sophie stood up immediately. "I'll wash," she mumbled, grabbing the plates. "No," Mrs. Gable snapped, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "I said sit. I will clean." "You always do everything," Sophie shot back suddenly. Her voice rose, cracking with teenage frustration. "Just let me help." "I said sit down." Mrs. Gable's voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. It was the voice of someone who was at the very end of their rope. Sophie flinched physically, pulling her arms tight against her chest. She sat back down, putting her head in her hands. Mr. Sterling watched this exchange, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a power struggle, but it wasn't a normal one. It was desperate. Mrs. Gable wasn't just being bossy, she was frantic to keep Sophie away from the sink, away from the chores, away from anything that might cause trouble. It was as if she thought Sophie was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched her, or maybe she thought Sophie was a bomb that would go off. Mr. Sterling stood up. He felt like he had to get away from the table. He walked to the large window that overlooked the city. The sun had gone down, and the city lights were flickering on, thousands of tiny stars in the concrete canyons below. He watched a car drive down the street, a simple, normal car with people going to a simple, normal home. He envied them. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Gable aggressively scraping the leftovers into the trash can. The sound was harsh, violent. He turned back to look at them. Mrs. Gable was running the water now, scrubbing the plates furiously. Sophie was still sitting at the table, motionless. The bruises. The fear. The silence. Mr. Sterling realized that the walls of his apartment were very thin in a way. They kept out the wind and the noise, but they couldn't keep out the pain. He looked at his hands, the hands that drew straight lines and built strong walls. They felt useless right now. He felt useless. He wanted to fix it, to draw a line through the problem and erase it, but life wasn't like a blueprint. You couldn't just erase mistakes with a swipe of whiteout. You had to deal with the mess. He took a deep breath and walked back toward the table. He knew he couldn't just let them leave like this. He knew that if he let them walk out that door, he might be letting Sophie walk back into a cage. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't do nothing. Mrs. Gable didn't turn around. She just kept scrubbing the same plate over and over, the water running, masking the sounds of her quiet weeping. The truth was hovering right there in the room, invisible and heavy, waiting for someone to be brave enough to say it out loud. And Mr. Sterling knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that it was going to have to be him. 3 days later, the routine of the week had taken a sharp, violent turn. Mr. Sterling's schedule had cleared up unexpectedly near the end of the week, and he found himself heading back to the apartment in the middle of the afternoon. It was unlike him to be home at this hour, and as he walked down the hallway, he noticed the quietness of the building. The air near his front door, however, felt different. It felt charged, like the atmosphere right before a lightning strike. Before he even put his key in the lock, he heard it. It wasn't a polite knock or the sound of the vacuum cleaner. It was a shout. A woman's voice, high and desperate, piercing through the thick wood of the apartment entrance. Mr. Sterling froze. His hand hovered over his keys. The voice was Mrs. Gable, but it didn't sound like the quiet, polite woman who dusted his bookshelves. This voice was raw, filled with a terrifying panic. "You have to stop? Do you hear me? You have to stop right now." Another sound followed a crash. It was the shattering of glass, loud and distinct. It wasn't the soft tinkle of a dropped cup, it was the explosive sound of something heavy hitting the floor and breaking into 100 pieces. Mr. Sterling didn't think about protocol or privacy. He didn't think about calling the security desk downstairs. He shoved his key into the lock and turned it violently. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The scene in the living room stopped him in his tracks. The room was in chaos. One of his favorite vases, a large, blue ceramic piece that sat on a stand near the hallway, was destroyed. Sharp shards of blue pottery were scattered across the hardwood floor like jagged confetti. But it was the people in the room that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Gable was standing in the center of the mess, but she wasn't the attacker. She was holding a broom in both hands, clutching it like a shield, her knuckles white from the strain. She was crying hysterically, tears streaming down her face, screaming at the girl in front of her. Sophie was standing a few feet away. Her hair was wild, her face twisted in an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. She wasn't cowering. She was lunging. "Give it to me!" Sophie screamed, her voice cracking. She was trying to dart past Mrs. Gable, reaching for something on the floor. "No!" Mrs. Gable shrieked, swinging the broom out to block the girl's path. It wasn't a swing meant to hurt, it was a desperate, clumsy attempt to build a wall. "I won't let you. I won't let you do it." I hate you. Get out of my way. Sophie yelled. She shoved the broom aside with surprising strength, her eyes wide and unfocused, like she was seeing something that wasn't there. Mr. Sterling stood frozen just inside the door. His brain was trying to process what he was seeing. Every assumption he had made for the last 3 days crumbled in an instant. He had been so sure. He had looked at Mrs. Gable's gentle hands and assumed she was the monster. He had looked at Sophie's bruises and assumed she was the innocent, silent victim. But now, as he watched the scene unfold, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Sophie wasn't backing away in terror. She was the one attacking. She was the force of destruction in the room. And Mrs. Gable, tiny, trembling Mrs. Gable, was putting herself directly in the line of fire, risking her own safety to stop her daughter. Sophie managed to dodge past the broom. She threw herself onto the floor, scrambling toward the pile of broken glass on her hands and knees. She didn't seem to care that the shards were razor sharp. Sophie, no! Mrs. Gable screamed. She threw herself onto the floor, grabbing Sophie around the waist and dragging her back. Don't touch it! Please, baby, don't touch it! Let go of me! Sophie thrashed wildly, her elbows flying back, connecting with Mrs. Gable's ribs. The older woman gasped in pain but didn't let go. She held on with everything she had, burying her face in her daughter's back, weeping openly. Mr. Sterling finally found his voice. Stop! He rushed forward, stepping carefully over the debris. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he had to break the cycle of violence. He reached them just as Sophie managed to break free from her mother's grip. Sophie scrambled forward, her hand reaching out for a large, jagged shard of the blue vase. Mr. Sterling moved faster than he had in years. He dropped to his knees and grabbed Sophie's wrist just before her fingers closed around the glass. Let go! Sophie shrieked, turning her wild eyes on him. For a second, he saw pure insanity in her face, a depth of anger that didn't belong in a child. Sophie, look at me, Mr. Sterling said, his voice firm and loud, cutting through the noise. He didn't let go of her wrist. He could feel how thin her arm was, how fragile her bones felt under his grip. There is glass everywhere. You are going to cut yourself to pieces. Sophie struggled for a moment longer, yanking her arm, breathing hard. But then, something shifted. The manic energy seemed to drain out of her suddenly, leaving her looking exhausted and small. She slumped forward, her chin hitting her chest, and began to sob. It wasn't the quiet crying of before, it was loud, ugly wailing, the sound of a dam finally breaking. Mr. Sterling let go of her wrist slowly. He looked at Mrs. Gable. The woman was kneeling on the floor, her hands covering her face. Her shoulders were heaving. She looked up at him, and the look in her eyes shattered him. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was a terrifying, profound love mixed with a helplessness so deep it looked like despair. I'm sorry, Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice barely audible over Sophie's crying. I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling. I tried to stop her. I tried. Mr. Sterling looked back at the floor. He saw a smear of blood on the hardwood where Sophie had been kneeling. He looked at Sophie's arms, which were exposed now. He saw the fresh scratches, the red marks, and yes, the bruises. But looking at them now, in the context of this struggle, they didn't look like the marks of a beating. They looked like the marks of a fight. They looked like restraint. The realization washed over him, cold and terrible. He had judged Mrs. Gable. He had sat in his high tower and condemned a woman for protecting her child from herself. The bruises weren't from abuse inflicted by a monster, they were battle scars from a war Mrs. Gable was fighting every single day to keep her daughter alive. Sophie wasn't just a troubled teen, she was a danger to herself, and Mrs. Gable was the only thing standing between her and the edge. Mr. Sterling slowly stood up. His knees creaked. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't waiting for something to break, it was the aftermath of the explosion. He looked at the shattered vase. It was just an object. It could be replaced. But the trust he had broken, the misunderstanding he had held in his heart for days, that was the real damage. He didn't say a word of judgment. He didn't ask for an explanation for the mess. He simply walked over to the sofa, pulled the cushion off, and brought it over to the floor. He placed it gently next to Mrs. Gable. "Sit," he said softly. Mrs. Gable looked at him, stunned. She opened her mouth to protest, to say she would clean it up, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She lowered herself onto the cushion, pulling Sophie into her lap. Sophie curled up into a ball, pressing her face into her mother's chest, her hands tucked between them to hide the blood. Mr. Sterling walked to the kitchen and came back with a roll of paper towels and a small first aid kit he kept in the hall closet. He knelt down again, not as the employer or the judge, but just as a human being. He handed the paper towels to Mrs. Gable. She took them with a trembling hand and began to gently wipe the dirt and tears from her daughter's face. The air in the apartment was no longer thick with secrets. It was thick with pain, real and raw pain. And as Mr. Sterling watched them, he realized that the bruises were just the visible part of a much deeper wound, one that couldn't be healed with silence or money. He had walked into a nightmare, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to draw the blueprint to get them out. The initial noise of the argument had faded into a heavy, uneven silence. The only sounds left in the room were the ragged breathing of Sophie and the quiet, choked sobs of her mother. The blue shards of the vase glittered on the floor like icy stars, a sharp contrast to the warm, emotional mess that had taken over the living room. Mr. Sterling stayed where he was, kneeling on the hardwood, but he shifted his weight slightly, feeling the ache in his knees. He realized that simply standing there or calling the police wasn't the answer. The dynamic was not criminal in the way he had initially thought, it was a tragedy. He didn't shout, and he didn't try to pull them apart. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand gently on Mrs. Gable's trembling shoulder. It was a tentative touch, awkward at first, but he meant it as a gesture of presence, not authority. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone in the middle of this storm. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice low and steady. "Breathe. Just breathe for a moment." The woman flinched at his touch, her muscles tensing up like a wire pulled too tight. But then, slowly, she seemed to collapse in on herself. The fight drained out of her posture, leaving her looking like a broken doll. She slumped forward, still clutching Sophie, and buried her face in her hands. She didn't speak. She just shook her head, a silent admission that she couldn't hold the weight of the world up anymore. Mr. Sterling stood up slowly, his joints protesting. He didn't want to leave them there on the floor surrounded by glass, but he also knew he needed to give them a moment to ground themselves. He walked carefully across the room to the window, giving them space while he tried to organize his own chaotic thoughts. He looked out at the city skyline. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long, orange shadows across the buildings. Down there, people were going home, making dinner, laughing. Up here, his perfect sanctuary felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. After a few minutes, he heard movement behind him. He turned around to see Mrs. Gable struggling to her feet, helping Sophie up. Sophie looked exhausted, drained of all the manic energy that had fueled her rage just moments ago. She looked small and pale, her eyes red and puffy. She was wiping her nose on her sleeve, looking at the floor with a mixture of shame and defiance. Mrs. Gable looked at Mr. Sterling. Her eyes were swollen, her face streaked with makeup and tears. She looked terrified, waiting for him to yell, to fire her, to tell them to get out of his house and never come back. I will clean this up," Mrs. Gable stammered, her voice shaking so badly she could hardly get the words out. "I will pay for the vase. I don't know how, but I will. I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling. I am so sorry." Mr. Sterling looked at the expensive blue ceramic scattered on the floor. Then he looked at the fresh scratches on Sophie's hands. The vase didn't matter. Not even a little bit. He walked back toward them, ignoring the glass crunching softly under his shoes. "I don't care about the vase," he said firmly. "I don't care about the mess." He gestured toward the large, comfortable sofa in the middle of the room. "Please. Sit down. Both of you." It wasn't a request, it was a command, but it was a kind one. Mrs. Gable hesitated, looking at the expensive upholstery, afraid they might dirty it. But Mr. Sterling's expression left no room for argument. She guided Sophie to the sofa. Sophie sat on the very edge, as if ready to bolt at any second, pulling her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. Mrs. Gable sat next to her, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to reach out if she needed to. Mr. Sterling pulled a chair over so he was sitting at their eye level. He didn't want to tower over them. He didn't want to be the boss right now. He wanted to be a human being. "I thought," Mr. Sterling started, then stopped. He had to be honest. "When I saw the bruises the other day, I thought you were hurting her," he said, looking directly at Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable let out a harsh, painful sound that was half laugh, half sob. She shook her head, covering her mouth with her hand. "No," she whispered. "Never. I would cut off my own hand before I hurt her." "Then who?" Mr. Sterling asked, his brow furrowed. "And why the silence? Why hide it?" Mrs. Gable looked down at her lap, picking at a loose thread on her apron. She took a deep, shuddering breath. When she spoke, her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reading from a script she had memorized to survive. "She does it to herself," Mrs. Gable whispered. Mr. Sterling felt a cold chill wash over him. He looked at Sophie, who was resting her forehead on her knees, hiding her face. "Self-harm?" Mr. Sterling asked softly. "It's more than that," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice gaining strength as she finally unburdened herself. "It's the rage. It comes like a storm. She can't control it. She doesn't remember it afterwards half the time. Those bruises on her arm." She grabbed herself in a panic because she couldn't stop the screaming in her head. "She throws things. She hits the walls. Sometimes she tries to hurt herself so the pain on the outside will match the pain on the inside." Mr. Sterling looked at the shattered vase again. It wasn't a tantrum. It was an illness. "And the bruises on her arms?" Mr. Sterling asked. "The ones that looked like fingerprints?" Mrs. Gable flinched again. "Those were from me," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But not because I was beating her. She was trying to run into the street the other day during an episode. She was going to throw herself in front of a bus. I had to grab her. I had to hold her down to keep her safe. I held her so tight because I was so scared she would die. I left the marks because I was desperate to save her. The room fell silent. Mr. Sterling felt a wave of guilt crash over him. He had judged her. He had looked at those marks and seen a villain, when all along it was a mother fighting a war with no weapons. She was grappling with a demon she couldn't see, trying to protect a child who was, in that moment, her own worst enemy. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mr. Sterling asked. "Why didn't you tell anyone you need help? Professional help." "I tried." Mrs. Gable cried out, the sudden volume making Sophie flinch. Mrs. Gable immediately lowered her voice, reaching out to stroke Sophie's hair, but Sophie pulled away. "I took her to the clinics. I waited in line for hours. They put us on lists. They gave us pills that made her sleep all day or made the anger worse. I work 2 jobs, Mr. Sterling. I clean houses, I work at a diner at night. I do everything I can to pay for it, but it's never enough. The insurance won't cover the good places, and the places I can afford, they are just warehouses." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I was so scared that if you knew, if anyone knew, you would take her away from me. They would say I couldn't protect her. They would put her in a system where she would be just a number. She's all I have. I lost everything else. I can't lose my baby." Mr. Sterling looked at Sophie. The girl hadn't looked up once. She was rocking back and forth slightly, humming a tune that didn't match the sadness of the room. It was a heartbreaking sight. The girl was trapped in her own mind, and the mother was trapped by the world's inability to fix it. "I am failing her," Mrs. Gable whispered, the tears falling freely now. "I look at her, and I see her slipping away. The silence scares me more than the screaming. When she looks at me, sometimes I don't know if she knows who I am anymore. I am losing her, Mr. Sterling. And I don't know what to do." It was the most raw, honest confession Mr. Sterling had ever heard. It stripped away all the layers of politeness and social hierarchy that usually existed between them. In that moment, she wasn't the maid and he wasn't the boss. They were just 2 people staring into the abyss of a child's suffering. The expensive furniture, the view, the money, it all meant nothing. It was just dust compared to the pain in that room. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He realized that his life had been very safe, very predictable, and very empty. He built walls for a living, but he had never built a shelter for a human heart. He looked at the cuts on Sophie's hands. Then he looked at the despair on Mrs. Gable's face. He knew he couldn't fix Sophie. He wasn't a doctor. But he knew people who were. He knew resources that money could unlock, resources that were invisible to people like Mrs. Gable who were just trying to survive the day. "We are not going to lose her," Mr. Sterling said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was solid, like a rock in a landslide. Mrs. Gable looked up, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time, terrified that it might be extinguished. "You aren't alone in this anymore," Mr. Sterling said. "I can't promise it will be easy. But we are going to get her help. Real help. Not the waiting list kind." He stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a notepad and a pen. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for the cost. He just started writing names and numbers. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't the silence of waiting for a blow to fall. It was the silence of a breath finally being taken after being held for too long. The truth was out, ugly and painful as it was, and now that it was in the light, it could finally be faced. The sun had finally set, and the city outside the large glass windows was a grid of artificial stars, flickering in the deep blue of the evening. Inside the apartment, the mood had shifted from chaotic to a heavy, exhausted calm. Mr. Sterling stood by the sliding glass door that led to his balcony, looking out but not really seeing the view. His mind was racing, processing the confession he had just heard. He thought about his own life, the carefully drawn blueprints, the structures he built to withstand wind and rain. He realized with a sudden pang of guilt that he had spent decades trying to make things that wouldn't break, while Mrs. Gable spent every day trying to hold together something that already had. He turned away from the window and looked back at the sofa. Sophie was now asleep, her head resting on her mother's lap. It wasn't a peaceful, deep sleep. Her breathing was still shallow and quick, and her brow was furrowed as if she was fighting battles even in her dreams. Mrs. Gable was stroking her hair gently, her movements slow and rhythmic, like she was trying to smooth out the wrinkles in a crumpled piece of paper. The woman looked older now, the weight of the secret she had been carrying finally visible in the deep lines around her eyes and the slump of her shoulders. Mr. Sterling walked over to the small desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook and a heavy pen. For a long moment, he just stared at the blank white page. He wasn't an architect right now, he was a man with resources, and for the first time, he had a real purpose for them. He began to write. He didn't write a check immediately. Instead, he wrote down a name. It was the name of a facility his own company had donated to years ago, a place he had only visited once for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a center specialized for adolescents suffering from severe trauma and self-harm. It wasn't just a clinic, it was a sanctuary, a place where they didn't just sedate the kids but tried to understand the screaming in their heads. He remembered the director there, a woman named Dr. Evans, who had spoken passionately about how mental health was the foundation of a stable life. At the time, Mr. Sterling had just nodded and thought about the tax deduction. Now, her words echoed in his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed the number, surprised to find that his hands were trembling slightly. It took some convincing. It was late, and it was a private facility, but when he mentioned who he was and the urgency of the situation, the tone on the other end of the line changed. He didn't just ask for an appointment, he demanded one. He didn't ask about the cost. He told them he would cover everything: the treatment, the stay, the therapy for the family, everything. He spoke with a firmness that surprised even him. When he hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of relief, like he had finally laid a brick that mattered. He walked back over to the living area. He didn't make a big announcement. He didn't want to wake Sophie. He simply knelt down beside Mrs. Gable, being careful not to step on the few remaining shards of blue pottery that were scattered on the rug. Mrs. Gable looked at him, her eyes wary and anxious, expecting him to say that he had called the authorities or that she needed to leave. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, afraid to break the silence. "She has an appointment," Mr. Sterling said softly, keeping his voice low. "Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. It is with Dr. Evans at the Riverside Center. I know the protocols there. They are good, Mrs. Gable. They don't just lock kids away. They help them." Mrs. Gable stared at him, her mouth opening slightly. She blinked once, then twice, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. "But, the insurance," she stammered automatically. "The waiting list is months long. And I can't." "There is no waiting list," Mr. Sterling interrupted gently. "And there is no bill for you to pay. It is taken care of. I want you to focus on her, not on the money. Tears welled up in Mrs. Gable's eyes again, but these were different. They weren't tears of despair or shame. They were tears of pure, overwhelming relief. She opened her mouth to thank him, but words failed her. She just nodded, a sob catching in her throat, and reached out to squeeze Mr. Sterling's hand. Her hand was rough and calloused from years of cleaning, warm and alive. Mr. Sterling squeezed back, feeling a connection he had never felt with any of his business partners or wealthy friends. "Go now," Mr. Sterling said, standing up slowly. "Take her home. Let her sleep in her own bed. You both need rest." Mrs. Gable carefully lifted Sophie's head from her lap. The girl murmured something but didn't wake. Mrs. Gable picked her up with a strength that seemed impossible for her small frame. Mr. Sterling watched as she carried her daughter toward the hallway. He opened the front door for them, holding it wide. At the door, Mrs. Gable turned back. "I will clean the mess tomorrow," she said, her voice barely audible. "I will fix everything." "Just go," Mr. Sterling said with a small, tired smile. "We will worry about the floor later." They left, and the apartment was quiet once again. But it wasn't the sterile, lonely silence of before. It felt lighter. The air didn't feel pressurized anymore. Mr. Sterling locked the door and turned back to the room. He looked at the empty sofa and then at the floor. The blue vase was still scattered across the hardwood, a chaotic mess of sharp edges and beautiful color. He walked into the kitchen and came back with a trash bag and a broom. He didn't call a cleaning service. He didn't ask Mrs. Gable to do it later. He kneeled on the floor and began to pick up the pieces. He worked slowly, carefully handling each shard of glass. It was meditative work. As he swept, he thought about the cracks in the vase. He had designed buildings to be perfect, seamless, and impervious to damage. But people weren't like that. People were like this vase, beautiful, but fragile. When life hit them hard, they didn't just shatter, they broke into pieces that were sharp and dangerous to handle, but just because they were broken didn't mean they were trash. It just meant they needed someone to care enough to pick up the pieces, to cut their fingers if necessary, to put them back together in a new shape. He swept the last of the dust into the pan and stood up. His back ached, and he felt a profound sense of tiredness, but it was a good kind of tired. He walked over to the glass door again. The city lights were brighter now. He looked at his reflection in the glass. He didn't see just an architect or a boss anymore. He saw a man who had finally learned that the most important structures we build aren't made of steel and concrete. They are made of kindness and understanding and the willingness to step into someone else's mess when they are too weak to clean it up themselves. He took a deep breath, exhaling the last of the tension in his chest. He picked up his phone to send a confirmation message for the morning appointment, and then he set it down on the counter. The apartment was clean, quiet, and empty. But for the first time in a long time, Mr. Sterling didn't feel alone.